So, welcome everyone to today's ENLIGHT lecture on equity and society. I'm happy that you found your way here to the lecture. My name is Daniel Schumann. I'm a research associate at the University of Göttingen, and I will be in a double role today. I will be moderating today's lecture and will also be one of the three presenters. And as you might know, this lecture was planned with 4 speakers, but unfortunately, Kristína Rankovová from the University of Bratislava will not be able to join us today for health reasons, and she sends us her best regards. So today we will have 3 short presentations from researchers from within the ENLIGHT network, and the schedule will be as follows. At first, we will hear the 3 presentations, and at the end, we will have some minutes left for a question and answer session. So please, if you have any questions that might come up during the 3 presentations, please be invited to post your questions in the chat, and we will try to answer them at the end of the lecture. And also, please be reminded of the networking event, which we will have after the lecture, to continue the discussion or use this opportunity also to develop some ideas for future cooperations. You are all invited to join us there. So having said this, I would like to welcome our first speaker for today, Sorana Toma, and I would like to briefly introduce her. Sorana Toma is an assistant professor in Migration and Refugee Studies at Ghent University at the Department of Public Health and Primary Care, and she's also a member of the Center for the Social Study of Migration and Refugees at the same university. Before this, Sorana Toma has been an assistant professor in sociology at the Center for Research on Economics and Statistics in Paris. And her research is concerned with patterns and drivers of international migration, as well as the dynamics shaping ethno-racial inequalities in European societies. So dear Sorana, I'm very much looking forward to your presentation on the role of migrant social capital in international migration, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for this introduction, and thank you all for the invitation. I will now be sharing my screen in a second. So I am a sociologist by background, and I've been, as Danielle has told you, been interested in what drives international migration, but also immigrants' integration in host context. And my focus has been on social ties, on social networks, and how social capital influences these processes. And I think I chose this topic also for my talk as of course it's an important focus in my work, but also because I think social capital is one of those very transferable concepts that have been widely applied across fields, across social science disciplines. So I'm hoping that some of my reflections will be useful for those of you working in other domains. I will just briefly present the outline of my talk today. I will work my way to a puzzle that I'm now conducting research on. And to help explain it, I will start in a more classical way by presenting some well-established concepts and empirical facts in sociology and in migration studies. I will then move on to criticizing this quite extensive literature on the role of social capital in migration, a literature which is sometimes lacking a nuance and a critical lens. And to hopefully bring some more nuance, I will again come back to the sociological literature on social capital, which has emphasized also what people have called the darker sides of social capital. And finally, I will try to think through these findings and asking myself and you as well about how these square with the findings from the migration literature, to which I also aim to contribute in a current work. So, what is social capital? Behind the concept of social capital, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, lies the quite simple and intuitive idea that our lives are influenced not only by how much we know and what we possess, but also by whom we know. So this is to say that the nature of our social relations with others has significant impact on the types of lives that we live. And a consensual definition is that social capital refers to the expected returns to social relationships. So basically that relationships can help us achieve goals that we might not otherwise have been able to achieve. And whereas several terms have been coined in the literature to express these ideas, social capital is the one that became most established as a term. However, besides this broad view that I have just exposed, there's a lot of fuzziness that surrounds the concept. And this has accumulated many definitions and generated a large amount of disagreement surrounding its measurement. This is why I allowed myself to come back a bit to this concept, which is actually quite well known. So a first source of confusion comes from the fact that some researchers conceptualize social capital as a collective good. For example, as a collectively produced and owned quality of populations from which all members benefit, for example, through collective norms and trust. And Coleman and Putnam have been most at the forefront of this perspective over social capital. The second perspective, situated at an individual level, envisages social capital more as resources embedded in individuals' social networks, which they may draw upon to gain, for example, returns, to gain benefits for their instrumental actions, such as finding a better job, for example. And Bourdieu also has written extensively on this concept, and his definition is one of that I copied below, is one of the most well-known of social capital. Ted Mao refers to this concept as the network type of social capital. This concept has also gained a lot of traction in the migration literature and has been picked on quite early by those trying to explain why do people move. So I'm now moving into the more migration, huge literature as well. And there's been several theories that have been formulated to explain the occurrence of international migration. So what drives people to cross borders? For example, the uneven geographic distribution of labor and capital, and hence disparities in wage rates. The domination exerted by some core countries over peripheral ones, the permanent demand for unskilled foreign labor in advanced industrial societies. There's been many, many models trying to explain migration, and all of these are really beyond the scope of my talk today. And none of these theories, however, can account, according to Thomas Feist, for this already quite well-known puzzle that he has written about many years ago. He asks more precisely, why are there so few migrants from so many places and so many from so few? So what exactly is he asking? Well, he's asking that although the world, about half of the world's population, we could say, could have both the economic motivation to move and the ability to do so, yet international migrants make up only about 3% of the population. At the same time, when we look at where migrants come from, we see that they often come from a few selected number of places, of communities. Some communities, indeed, in some countries are almost deserted with extremely high rates of out-migration, whereas other communities in similar economic situation have very few migrants. So according to Feist and many others, economic disparities are not a sufficient explanation and cannot account for these patterns alone. Whereas such opportunity differentials may explain the initiation of migration, other dynamics should be sought for to explain the perpetuation of flows and also their concentration along specific geographic corridors. And one element of this internal dynamics of the migration process is, of course, the development of what has been called migrant networks. And the idea behind these is that with each individual migration, there's an increasingly dense web of contacts between sending and receiving contexts. As these migration networks develop and expand, there's an increase in the likelihood of every additional movement, as these migrant networks, by their presence, are lowering the costs and raising the expected benefits or net returns, as economists would put it, to migration. And these ideas have been, again, revisited and most influentially written about by Messi ever since the 1980s, or De Haas later on, Heinrich. Migration networks shape migration through two types of channels. Basically, they both shape the aspirations to move, for example, by shaping people's ideals of a good life. When a migrant returns and has manages in their origin communities and manages to build a very big and ostentatious house, or comes back with an expensive car, everybody in the community will end up wanting that. So gradually there's a culture, what has been called a culture of migration, that develops in some origin communities as migration becomes the norm. And it transforms the local behaviors, local attitudes, and also aspirations. Of course, migrants, return migrants, those who already have some experience with migration, can provide information about potential destinations to those who may be aspiring to migrate. And then they may also influence people's abilities or capabilities to turn their aspirations into actual behavior. So they can, for example, send funds to cover the costs of the trip, or they can also help migrants find jobs and housing at destinations. So this is what would, for example, increase the benefits. And there's been tons, it would take me several slides, I think, to cite all the research that has has found some empirical evidence that having ties abroad, that having links to friends, acquaintances, or family abroad is an important driver of migration likelihood, of people's chances to migrate, and of their choice of destination. So I will not, it's not what I plan to do now. The migration literature has drawn extensively on this social capital literature and has translated, and I have also contributed a bit to that, to the definition of migrants' social capital, so which is defined in some articles as the collection of resources that individuals may access through their ties to prior migrants, and which may facilitate their international mobility and also access to foreign employment. So this is what I mean by migrant social capital. It's particularly those ties to prior migrants, to those with some migration experience. However, and this is where things, I think, become more interesting, is that the fact that migrant networks play a crucial role in the migration process has sort of become an undisputed fact. And perhaps because it's such an undisputed fact, I feel research has not often pushed the analysis further, and has not sufficiently, I think, paid attention to instances where networks do not have the expected returns. So a bit like also in the general social capital literature, migrant networks have been perceived as a cure to every problem. And prior migrants have been assumed to provide as much assistance as they can whenever possible, and to facilitate the migration of anyone related to them. And there is quite some older qualitative research, a bit scattered in the sense that not building onto a systematic framework, which suggests that this is indeed not necessarily the case. And I will just very briefly illustrate with some quick example. For example, studying Salvadoran migration in the US, Cecilia Menjivar shows that in many cases, migrant networks failed to provide the expected assistance as social relations became conflictual, broke down altogether at destination, or even became exploitative. Other research suggests that, for example, that the tightening of immigration restrictions turns migrants from bridgeheads, helping people to migrate, to gatekeepers, closing the gates to newcomers. So these studies argue that as migration becomes more difficult, established migrants are increasingly unwilling to help prospective migrants, and particularly the lower skill. I have also contributed to this more nuanced look at networks in my own quantitative research, which has focused also on the gender dimension. And I have shown that in patriarchal contexts, such as that of Senegal and Senegalese migration to Europe, men and women do not use their networks in the same way. And men are often unwilling to help women, particularly women who are looking to migrate on their own in an autonomous, independent form of female migration, and they are more likely to be gatekeepers to those forms of migration. To make sense of this more critical literature, which shows that migrant networks are not this undifferentiated resource that is equally helpful to anyone and always helpful in their migration process. I think it's useful to go back to the general sociological literature on social capital, to some of its teachings, which I feel have not yet been incorporated in the migration literature sufficiently, and which relate very well to today's topic, to equity, to this idea in equity. So sociologists have made a big fuss about social capital, of course, and social embeddedness as being so important, but some of them quite early on, Bourdieu, one of the first, were also pointing out a fact, which is the following, that actually social capital is also a mechanism through which advantaged individuals maintain and increase their economic and otherwise advantaged position. So basically, it's an important mechanism through which social inequalities are perpetuated and intensified. And why is that so? It's because often social capital adds on to other forms of capital. They go together, human, financial, and social capital. Why is that? Why do we observe differences, for example, in the role of social capital? Why did this empirical research show that it's mostly the most advantaged individuals that really make the best use of social capital, that benefit the most from social networks? A sociologist writing already in the 90s, Nan Lin, has really broken this down in different pathways, explaining this. Explaining how there's an inequality in social capital and also social capital as an inequality producer. First of all, he argues that there's differential access to social capital. And indeed, there's a lot of research that shows that higher status individuals are more likely to have social ties, first of all, but also to be embedded in larger, more wide-ranging, more diverse and influential networks. Whereas the networks of those lower skilled, lower status individuals tend to be smaller, denser, and more homogeneous. So they have higher status individuals have a larger access, have more better quantity and better quality of social capital. Besides that, there's also, the literature has found there's also differential returns or benefits to one's social capital. So there's been less research on that, fewer empirical studies, it's a bit more difficult, but findings tend to confirm that members of upper classes enjoy greater rewards despite similar social resources. Why is that? Sandra Smith, a sociologist writing in the 2000s, writes that an important part of this is also linked to the mobilization of social capital. So these would be the three main dimensions of social capital: access, returns, and mobilization. And she argues that partly responsible for the lower returns that lower skilled individuals may get from their social capital is that they are less successful in mobilizing their social ties. Maybe because their social ties may be more reluctant to help them, maybe because they are also not activating the most useful parts of social ties. In general, the mobilization of social ties is something that still needs a lot of empirical attention, I believe. So this brings me finally to the puzzle that I'm now working on, and which I need a bit of a detour to explain to you. So given these findings from the general sociological literature, I was curious to see how does migration literature look at the social stratification of social capital and of migrant social capital. And it was interesting to see, first of all, that there's not a lot of research on this, but that in general, migration scholars have usually seen the social capital embedded in migrant networks, so the ties to family and friends abroad, as rather expanding access to opportunities such as migration. And if you remember, the basic argument put forward by Douglas Massey and his colleagues is that as migrant networks grow within a given origin community, the costs to migration and its risks go down, making it more accessible. So they argue that more recent migrants, whereas the pioneers of migration from a certain community will be the one who are more likely to have to be in a more advantageous socioeconomic position, those more recent followers are increasingly likely to come from a broader set of social origins than earlier migrants. In other words, to be in a lower socioeconomic position. However, there's very few empirical studies that have really looked into how social stratification and migrant social capital are related. And it's economists who have conducted most of the studies, and they, however, tended to look at the meso level, at the level of communities or at the level of countries. And their results have been quite mixed. Some studies do not really find this pattern of growing migrant networks and broadening access to migration and opportunities for migration, whereas others do find that selectivity into migration decreases as migrant networks expand, which suggests that networks are more valuable for the less skills. So what I argue together with my colleague Maome Liu is that we really need some more research from the migration side. We really need to integrate these nuanced and critical findings from the sociological literature about the role of social capital into the migration literature and ask questions such as, do lower status individuals have less access to and benefit less from migrant networks in terms of their migration chances, as the sociological literature would then lead us to expect? Because if it's the case, then network effects will really concentrate socioeconomic advantage, as has been found. Or is it really that migrant social capital is a substitute for other forms of capital, for human capital, for financial capital, and in this way would open new opportunities for lower status individuals to access migration through these migrant ties? And we have started looking into that by analyzing a big quantitative survey on international migration from Africa to Europe, and we find a mixed answer to this question. We find, and I will finish with that on the one hand side, access to migrant ties in countries such as Senegal, Congo, Ghana is quite stratified, socially stratified. It's really higher educated individuals who are better connected to migrant networks, both in terms of stronger or weaker ties. However, and this is in contrast to the sociological literature, these networks tend to play a relatively smaller role in their chances to migrate compared to the lower educated individuals. And the higher educated are also less likely to actively mobilize their migrant ties to fund their trip. However, that doesn't mean that they don't activate other forms of social capital. And it was a quite surprising finding to see that they draw on their local-based social capital. So we find that social and human capital are partial substitutes for one another in terms of migration chances. But we think that given the highly uneven access to migrant networks, these are probably likely to exacerbate society or community level inequality in access to migration. I will leave it to that. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share some of my work and some of the puzzles that animate me these days. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sorana, for this very interesting presentation and the really big picture I think you gave us, and the puzzle and your questions at the end that might really be interesting to discuss. So thank you again. So we will continue now with the next presentation, which will be my own one. I already presented myself. My name is Daniel Schumann. I'm a research associate and a PhD candidate in sociology at the Diversity Research Institute at the University of Göttingen in Germany. And my research interests include reflexive diversity and migration studies, the sociology of knowledge, and also textbook and discourse research. And I'm currently working in a project funded by the German Ministry of Education and Research on diversity and teacher education, which is jointly developed or led by the Diversity Research Institute and the Department of Political Science at the University of Göttingen. And my research on representations of migration and integration in civic education textbooks emerged out of this context, and I will present some findings from this in this presentation, and I will now share my screen and hope that you can see it now. Exactly. So my presentation will be on the topic of seeing like a state, the politics of integration in civic education textbooks. And I would like to start this presentation with the controversies around the concept of integration. But maybe first it is important to say that at a first glance, integration does not seem at all to be a controversial issue. Because if we look at the public discourse about migration in Germany and in many other European countries too, we see that integration seems to be that what we want, whoever this we might be. But several scholars have highlighted the very fuzzy and open character of the concept, which makes it possible that many different and sometimes even contradictory ideas can operate under the header of immigrant integration. And it is exactly this fuzziness, I think, that might explain the success and the spread of this concept. And the different meanings migration scholars attribute to integration becomes clear if we look at some metaphors used by those scholars to explain what integration is and what vision of society this implies. So on this slide, you can see two pictures or two metaphors, and that both of them are associated to food is not due to the dinner time we have in Germany right now, but rather to the fact that these metaphors are really widely used in scientific discourse about integration now, at least in Germany. And for German sociologist Aladin El-Mafanani, integration processes can be described with a dining table, which you can see on the left-hand side. Society is a dining table, and integration then a process in which generations of migrants were first excluded from the table, but then increasingly sit at the table, want a piece of the pie, and ultimately have a say in the recipe. This is the metaphor Aladin El-Mafanani uses. Danish anthropologist Mikkel Ritter is much more pessimistic about the concept of integration, which you can see on the metaphor on the right-hand side. Integration, Mikkel says, promotes a vision of society resembling a cup of soup, with newcomers being expected to blend in and dissolve as fast as possible. Critiques of the concept of immigrant integration have become stronger in the last years, especially thanks to critical and reflexive scholarship that has highlighted the colonial underpinnings of the concept of integration. See, for example, Adrian Favel's last book on the integration nation, in which he argues that integration is a nationalizing practice and way of thinking through which post-imperial states continue their civilizing mission and maintain their position in the unequal structure of the world system. Integration scholars have reacted in, I would say, broadly three ways to these critiques. Some argue that integration should be continued to use as an analytical concept, but maybe in a slightly modified way. Others, however, urge to abandon the concept and do not use it at all. And there is a third position of scholars claiming that it is important to observe exactly on a meta level how and with which hierarchizing effects actors actually use the concept of integration. And for today's presentation, I would follow this third position. And while scientific knowledge production about integration is increasingly being analyzed from such a reflexive position, school textbooks are still under research in this research field. So this is the starting point of my research on the translation of integration in civic education textbooks. Why are textbooks important to analyze? Civic education textbooks play a crucial role in producing official hegemonic knowledge and also in constructing ideal future citizens. We also know from quantitative research that textbooks are still widely used in civic education classes in Germany, at least. So in my PhD project, I investigate how civic education textbooks in post-migrant Germany translate knowledge about integration and which imaginations about normality and difference they construct in this process. To answer this question, I use a discourse analytical research design, drawing also on theoretical considerations from the Reflexive Diversity Research Program and Reflexive Migration Studies. So when thinking sociologically about the translation of integration and related ideas of normality and difference, we should, in my opinion, first of all, think about the social grammar of knowledge circulation in civics textbooks. That means thinking about how and on which levels textbooks actually translate knowledge. And I propose to distinguish 3 levels of analysis here. Firstly, textbooks authorize certain stocks of knowledge and have to bring them in a consistent form. They have to construct a learning narrative. And these learning narratives are very powerful in the ways that select some parts, some knowledge as being part of the story and others not. So this means also that textbooks need to incorporate discourses from outside the pedagogical field, from the media, from political and scientific discourse, for example. And this leads to a second level of analysis, which I denominate here as modes of enacting knowledge. So here is the question: how, in which form, and with which claims of truth do they actually translate these knowledge from outside the pedagogical field to within the pedagogical field? And thirdly, textbooks also construct ideas about pupil subjects. They do this on the one hand because they are based on assumptions about pupils who will be working with the textbooks. For example, that they might be able-bodied, they might be native speakers, or holding the German citizenship. On the other hand, they also construct an ideal pupil. That means a vision of how a civically educated pupil could or should look like. So my study shows that ideas about integration, normality, and difference play out on each of these levels, and that these levels are also intertwined. But in the remaining minutes, I would like to give an somehow exemplary insight into one of these 3 levels, the modes of enacting knowledge about integration in civic education textbooks. So one mode of enacting knowledge is what I call objectification. In this mode, integration appears as an objectively given fact, as the truth, and making an invisible competing concepts and alternative visions of integration or other concepts. So in the textbooks, we find this mode represented in definitions and explanations, in uncontested expert opinions, in the voice of the authorial textbook's narrator, and in the many diagrams that seek to represent integration in a pedagogical form. Here you can find one example of how a vision of integration as assimilation of diversity to the German nationalist mainstream is legitimized. A second mode is what I call controversialization. In this mode, integration is enacted as a controversial issue, as a topic for which there is not the one and only truth, but conflicting claims about what integration is, was, or maybe should be. This mode is represented often in pro-contra representations or in such tables as you can see it here, in which pupils should position themselves to questions such as the one you can see here. It says in the headline, in translation, people who migrated to Germany can be seen as integrated if, and you then have like some items here that you can tick. For example, they cook German food, accept the equality of men and women, or speak German at home. One can then, on the right-hand side of this table, tick very important, important, or unimportant, and so position yourself to these statements. Interestingly, integration as a concept itself is rarely seen as controversial in the textbooks, only the ways of achieving integration. A third mode can be called personalization. In civic education textbooks, we find many materials in which young migrants share their stories of migrating to and integrating in Germany. In this mode, integration is enacted from a situated perspective and based on supposedly authentic personal experiences. What we often see here is a conflation of categories of migration and religion, what also previous textbook research has shown. So in that, migrants are supposed to be Muslims and the other way around. Also, in my research, I found that stories about integration often appear to be dichotomous. Or we have successful stories of integration, of which you can find a visual example, a very extreme example maybe on this slide, or other stories of failed integration and stories of being trapped in a patriarchal culture. More often it is the figure of an oppressed Muslim woman who needs help rather than the figure of an activist Muslim woman that is represented in this mode of personalization. Anti-racism and anti-sexism are played off against each other in many cases of these textbooks. So to conclude, I would like to summarize that civic education textbooks do not only construct learning objects, but while doing so, they also construct powerful notions of normality and difference. Teacher education should enable prospective teachers to deconstruct such notions and to problematize them in civic education classes. But I would also like to appeal to migration scholars and social scientists in general, because we should, I think, look more closely at civic education textbooks than we have in the past. They confront us not only, but also with the question of which knowledge produced in academia is made relevant in school textbooks, and according to which and whose criteria it is an appropriate one. With this, I would like to thank you very much and stop sharing my screen now. Wonderful. So, and then we are already in our third and last presentation, and I would like to invite Janne Holmén to share his screen or share his picture first. And Janne Holmén is an associate professor in the history of education at Uppsala University. His main research interests are historiography, textbook research, educational history, identity, and island studies. And Janne Holmén has conducted several research projects on, maybe to summarize it like that, the relation between education and political culture. For example, the project Driving Forces of Democracy, and to name the current one, a project with the title Figuring Politics, in which Janne Holmén is investigating from a comparative point of view how diagrams have been used to portray the political landscape in civic education textbooks. Based on this research project, Janne Holmén will today talk about diagrams of unity and diversity in civic education textbooks. And dear Janne, I'm very looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. Yes, this presentation will be based on my project, Figuring Politics, as you mentioned. And I will talk today about some diagrams from civic education textbooks from different countries around the world. And what I will focus on, it is how these textbooks and the diagrams in them, how they display unity or diversity. And this is important because unity and diversity, they are two important elements of nation building. If a regime wants to create a united society and some kind of national unity, they need to try to keep society from disintegrating into different parts such as ethnic, religious, geographical ideological or even individual parts, then you need to find some kind of principle of unity or so. But on the other hand, if you are emphasizing this unity too much, then it might be possible that some small groups and some individuals, they might be alienated from this very focused narrative of unity. And because of that, it's important to also try to include some kind of diversity in the narrative in order that everyone feels included, and that way they can become a part of the unity, so to speak. So it is also necessary to recognize the diversity that exists in society. Civic education has an important role to play in this regard in nation building. And as I mentioned, I will focus now on some diagrams in civic education textbooks that have been important in this regard. If you start with discussing diagrams, a lot can be said about diagrams, and I don't really have much time to go into the theories and classifications of what diagrams are, so to speak. But we can say that some important building blocks of diagram constructions, they can be divided into arranging, that means to place something in the diagram in proximity or distance from each other, and thereby you can suggest that some things belong together because they're close together in the diagram, or they don't belong together because they are far apart. Linking is another principle. By connecting with lines, for example, or by drawing a circumference around something, encircling something, you can illustrate that they belong together. Another technique is varying. In the diagram, you can vary colors or texture, for example, and thereby you can keep like items together and also show diversity between different items. Here we have one example from a Swedish textbook. This is a quite recent Swedish textbook. It is Forum Samhällskunskap from 2017. Similar diagrams have been in use since approximately 2007, and there have been some small changes between editions. Here you see on the bottom, you see the left-right spectrum. That's probably the most common political diagram that is in use. There you see the left is the socialist parties to the left, and then you see the right-wing parties to the right. And that is the horizontal axis here. It displays their how conservative they are in economical questions. Above them, you can see different ideologies: communist, socialism, social democracy, social liberalism, conservatism, nationalism. And on the very top, you see democracy. The light of democracy is shining on most of these ideologies. But that you see, the right wing of nationalism and the left wing of communism is left outside the light of democracy. So, and that signifies that they are not considered really democratic ideologies. They are on the fringes, so to speak. So this is quite a normative diagram of the political system in Sweden that says that some ideologies are okay and some are not. But all the parties in the Swedish parliament, they are at least described as democratic in this diagram. If you look at this diagram from Egypt in 2012, this is after the Arab Spring, and this diagram is attempting to portray the diversity in the party system before the first elections after the Arab Spring, when there were some hopes of democracy. Here you see there are many more parties than what was the case in the Swedish diagram. And here we have two axes. One is the left-right axis, with the socialists to the left and the conservatives to the right. And then you also have a religious dimension. So you have the Islamist parties in the top, and secular in the bottom. And these different parties, because there were so many, they tried to form alliances. And these alliances, they are connected to each other by these dotted lines. So in the top right, you have an Islamist alliance, which came to dominate after the elections. But you also have different constellations, and some, you can see one to the left there, we have some socialist and some Islamist parties, which are relatively close to each other in the diagrams. So you can say that this diagram, it does show quite a lot of diversity, but in contrast to the Swedish one, which placed all the parties on the same level and in the light of democracy, so to speak, here the diversity is so large that it might be possible that the diagram conveys some kind of fragmentation rather than unity. Here we have another kind of country, Bahrain. This is the textbook in civic education from 2017. And this textbook here, if you read the constitution of Bahrain, you see that the country is defined by its rulers. It's written there that the head of state is the son of the monarch and his sons and so on. And here legitimacy for the state is conveyed through the lineage of the ruling dynasty. And you can say that this was a very common way of legitimizing nations before the building of nation states. But it's also today in some dynastic nation states, is also today still used in this regard. Bahrain is a majority Muslim country, and they have emphasized this dynasty, and also in the constitution they emphasize religion. But if you go to another majority Muslim country, Indonesia, they shows a different strategy. Indonesia was one of the first third world countries to become independent after the Second World War. And even though it is a majority Muslim country, they chose not to use religion, the Islamic religion, to be the common denominator when they were trying to form a national identity. Instead, they invented and constructed a new national ideology called Pancasila, the 5 principles. And if you look at the national emblem of Indonesia, which is here on the textbook, you see on the front page, this is a national emblem called Garuda Pancasila. And on the emblem, you find this bird called the Garuda, and you also find the shield in the middle, which have 5 different symbols. And they symbolizes the 5 principles of Pancasila. And religion is only one of these principles. It's the one, after a lot of compromise, they agreed that religion was maybe still the most important principle, and it's placed in the middle. But it should be, it's some kind of religion on a more principle level and not tied to a particular creed or so. And then that's symbolized by the star, and you also have the tree that is symbolizing the unity of the people. The roots of the tree should symbolize that different in Indonesia, which is an archipelago with many different religions and many different peoples, still everyone, even though they have different roots, they grow together to one common tree. And Pancasila, which is this principle, it's a school subject, and this is the textbook in Pancasila. And Pancasila, it comes also in, it's a theme that recurs at many places in Indonesian society. Finally, I can show one last example. This is from a textbook from Namibia, and this is in 1983, before already Namibia gained independence from South Africa. We had the independence movement, SWAPO, was fighting for independence during this time. And this textbook was printed in Germany in cooperation between some German scholars and a UN organization and the liberation movement, SWAPO. And there were a lot of diagrams attempting to create a common identity for the Namibian people. And what this diagram is intended to show, it is the importance of unity in fighting the enemy. The diagram on the top here illustrates that if one stick, it's very easy to break, but if you put many sticks together, then the sticks become strong enough to resist. And this is quite an unusual type of diagrams, but they do exist because it doesn't only use the visual-spatial dimension of spatial cognition, but also the motor aspects of it. Usually, most diagrams only use 2 dimensions in a quite static manner, but here you can feel in your muscles how this diagram is supposed to convey some kind of meaning with the help of spatial cognition, because the fundamental principle in most diagrams is that you use your ability for spatial cognition in order to understand the relationships between some kind of abstract entities. And this is why diagrams are so effective in trying to convey abstract concepts. Yes, thank you. That was my presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, dear Janne, thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation and also for taking us through these diagrams. I think this is really, through this diversity of diagrams also, I think this is really interesting to see like the different functions of such diagrams and the different constructions associated with it. So now I would also like to invite Sorana, you again to join us here. We have now reached the end of the 3 presentations. If someone has a question, please post it in the chat. If not, we can also discuss within our group of 3 persons. So if one of you has maybe a comment or a question, please go ahead. If not, I would just have one maybe open question related to the topic of equity. So maybe also, again, thinking from your research, what would be important steps now towards more equity from your research perspective? What are things that should be more stronger investigated or practically be done beyond the science, beyond academia, maybe? If you have any thoughts on this, would be interesting to hear.
Maybe I can go first. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your question. And I was thinking a lot about that actually when carrying out my current research. It's hard to come up with policy measures when we are talking about things such as social capital and social ties and social relations that people develop amongst themselves. But I think often social ties or social networks are seen as a bit uncritically as a potential solution for a lot of inequity issues. And I think it's important to take a nuanced perspective over their role and really not fall into this idealistic sometimes or idealizing look at social ties, which I think the literature has often described as a cure to every problem, including inequity. So I think it's quite important to keep this critical lens. I'm not sure about the interventions that you could take in order to remedy, but I think being aware of the more subtle ways in which inequality is reproduced and reinforced even, I think it's already useful when assessing the situation. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I could maybe say a few words, since my research now was related to textbooks and diagrams. There's also a discussion about to which degrees books and are neutral, whether they are equal in that respect, that everyone have the same access to them, or do you have some kind of special cultural capital or knowledge base in order to understand them, and so on. And there also diagrams are interesting to discuss. Are they understandable to everyone? There have been such attempts to construct systems of diagrams or symbols that should be understandable to everyone, like the signs on handicapped toilets or something like that. And there are also different attempts. And I think there's still a debate in this aspect, but I think there is a very strong common base among all people that abstract thinking can be helped by this kind of spatial arrangement like diagrams, but also some aspects of the diagrams are very much culture specific. And you can see it if you look at the very first persons who used the timeline, for example. They described very in detail how a timeline works. Now it's natural for us to speak in terms of the timeline, but when they first were introduced, they were considered a novelty and they had to be explained in detail how they work and so to speak. I think that's something very interesting, very important to keep in mind when you're writing textbooks or constructing diagrams, that they can help equity, but that also means that you might need to explain some things that are not self-evident to everybody. The basics also have to be explained.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I can just maybe add some words also on the topic of textbooks, because I think also for me it is important to say that textbooks do really also have a potential to problematize structures of inequality. At the same time, they are part of the structure, and I think this is the dilemma maybe in which every knowledge production or circulation is in. But I think it would be important from my perspective also to look for closer cooperations between social scientists and textbook authors, because I think in many ways this was what especially sociology, from my perspective, other disciplines too, but what sociology is doing to think about reality in a critical way and to problematize the own assumptions we are having on the world. And I think this would be very important, like to find more cooperations between social scientists and textbooks authors as we have it now. Yes. Yeah, maybe this could also be a link to the networking event we have now. If there are not further questions, you can now find the link to the networking event in the chat. So please, if you want to join us, you are invited to go on with the discussion and maybe also to develop some future cooperations or project ideas together. Please feel free to join this event. And yeah, this is the opportunity for me to thank you, Janne and Sorana, again for your wonderful presentations, and also thank you to ENLIGHT for this opportunity to present our research here. And we hope to see you again the next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.